Chapter 1, My Father, the Fool or the Magician? I think I learned to be a fool from my father. Marcus's grandfather, Grandpa Lee. And let me give you a classic example of my father, the fool. I grew up in the Central Valley in Fresno, which is very flat and very hot. And I have heard people not very kindly refer to it as one of the armpits of California. In fact, one time Marcus and I were down in Fresno visiting my parents. It was 112 degrees, which it's going to be again this next Tuesday. And Marcus stepped out of the air-conditioned car into this blast of heat, and he looked at me and he said, "Why do people even live here?" And yet, the whole time I was growing up, my father would tell the story to anyone who would listen of when he fell in love with Fresno. So the year was 1948. He had just graduated from law school, passed the California bar exam, married my mom, and the two of them wanted to find a place to settle down and to raise a family. So my father describes that he drove north and that when he saw Fresno, he was overcome with amazement at its beauty. So that spring, the wildflowers were all blooming. There were lupin and lilies and poppies. Fruit trees were blooming. As he drove east into town, there was the Sierra Nevada mountains. There was still snow on the mountaintops. You know, the horizon was shimmering with clouds. And he knew that he had found what he was looking for. So he thought that Fresno was paradise. So when I was a teenager, and he would tell this story, I was so mortified because I knew how people thought of Fresno, and he just sounded ridiculous talking about falling in love with it. But then years later, when we were in Fresno with our sons, Marcus and Davy, and I heard my dad tell the same story, but this time I had a different reaction because I felt this surge of affection and respect for this man whose memory and imagination had transformed an ordinary place like Fresno into a place where he built a home. He and his wife, my mother, had 4 children. When the children grew up, they then had grandchildren. When Amanda was singing that song about what a wonderful world, they had a wonderful world there. Friends shaking hands, saying, "I love you." And then in the spring of 2010, this was 62 years after that day when my dad fell in love with Fresno, both of my parents died within a month of each other in our family home. And when we opened the safe that contained all these legal documents of my father's that we knew we needed to keep, out tumbled this bundle of cards. And when we looked at it, we discovered that my father had kept all of his Father's Day cards and every single Valentine that his wife had ever given to him. And my father thought that my mother was the most beautiful woman in the world. So I ask you, what do you think? Was my father a fool? Standing on the edge of a cliff, just looking up, filled with hope and dreams about the life that he could build with his beautiful bride? Or instead, was he like the magician, holding a wand up to the sky with an infinity symbol above his head, a garden of roses and lilies in front of him, and his other hand pointing down to the earth? So what do you think? My father, the fool, or the magician. I think of a poem by Mary Oliver that I love, When Death Comes. When it's over, I want to say, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. Chapter 2, Positive Illusions, Friend or Foe. So it's probably a lot because of my father that I've always been really fascinated with this fluid, flirtatious boundary between sages and fools, between illusions and reality. And then I read an article on depression by Andrew Solomon, and I became even more intrigued. So here's the sentence in what I was reading that really stopped me in my tracks. He wrote, "Accuracy of perception is not an evolutionary priority." Accuracy of perception is not an evolutionary priority. And he goes on to write that, quote, "Normal human thought and perception is marked not by accuracy, but by positive self-enhancing illusions about the self, the world, and the future." Solomon cited to the work of Dr. Shelley Taylor, who was a psychology professor at UCLA, and she wrote a book called Positive Illusions, where she explained that the mildly depressed actually appear to have a more accurate view than other people of themselves, the world, and the future. The mildly depressed lack the positive illusions that can promote mental health and resiliency. So what kind of positive illusions is Dr. Taylor referring to? I'm familiar with some. For example, every morning I make a to-do list because I have the positive illusion of how much I can accomplish in a day. Also, I probably have an illusion about how much control I have over my life, over the life of my children. Dr. Taylor studied patients, for example, recovered cancer patients who have the positive illusion that they are not going to have another bout with cancer, but it's actually beneficial. What she calls these are benign fictions or restorative optimism. Now, certainly there is a treacherous underbelly here. For one thing, there's a difference between the mildly depressed who see the world as it is and people who are struggling with a serious mental condition that can be even life-threatening. And then also Dr. Taylor's studies have been criticized by some as being really oriented towards white middle-class values. But I wonder if any of you have read a book that has a different spin about the dangerous underbelly, or one that we can recognize. It's called Bright-Sided by Barbara Ehrenreich. So she makes a convincing case for how the relentless promotion of positive thinking has undermined America. And I was especially intrigued by her chapter on the Christian right. The chapter was entitled, "God Wants You to Be Rich." So she writes about how megachurches compete for the biggest market share of members and television audiences and book sales. Millions of people are lured in to what Christian theology professor Reverend Michael Horton calls a cotton candy theology, a cotton candy gospel. So gone is the mystery and awe. God has been reduced to a kind of major domo or personal assistant. He fixeth my speeding tickets. He findeth me a parking place. He gets me a good table at the restaurant. He leadeth me to book contracts. So I imagine that all of us imagine the danger of taking positive illusions too far. So the question might be, how do we distinguish between life-enhancing, resiliency-promoting positive illusions and unhealthy delusions that can promote denial? Activist writer Noam Chomsky warned that some of the most insidious forces we face are those institutions that benefit by creating a sense of reality that's not really real. I'm sure you all are familiar with 1984, the prophetic dystopian novel by George Orwell, and back in 1946, he wrote about politicians. He said, political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. So it sounds pretty familiar in 2022. So as Unitarian Universalists, we really strive to be informed, responsible citizens of our county, of our state, of our country, of our world. So we're living out our values and our principles of dignity and worth, of justice and freedom for everyone. And so that means that we need to continue to resist manipulation and continue to be vigilant, to guard against untruths, and to demand the truth, at least as best we can. We are part of the guardians of those values, and I think that Unitarian Universalists, it's been called a faith for our time, and I think in a lot of ways it really is more important than ever that we live out loud our values. So the problems of the 21st century are unbelievably complicated. You know, there are systems of power that are so hard to interrupt, but we cannot give up. I love what J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, what he wrote. He said, "It's no good to leave a dragon out of your calculations if you live near one." Chapter 3, to serve or to savor. So we know about the dragons we live near. And we know about the overwhelming fear and despair that we sometimes feel when we face those dragons. Mary Oliver wrote another poem called Wild Geese, and one of the lines from that, she says, "Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine." But you know what? Today I want to ask you some different questions. So tell me about hope, yours, and I will tell you mine. Tell me about faith, yours, and I will tell you mine. Tell me about beauty and joy in your life, and I will tell you mine. Because we can't keep our spirits up. We can't keep putting one foot in front of the other or writing our to-do lists or moving forward. Without these, we need hope, we need faith, we need love, we need beauty. So many years ago, there was a former president of the UUA, Reverend Dr. William Schultz, who wrote some words. He was also the executive director of Amnesty International. So what he wrote is, "How can any of us doubt the magnificence of a world that contains luscious pears and endless seas and jazz by Duke Ellington and paintings by Georgia O'Keeffe? But to savor that magnificence, we need resources to buy the pear. We need time to visit the sea. As basketball player Moses Malone so aptly put it, if you don't got the ball, you sure can't shoot." So religion's job, he writes, is both to signal the gifts and to help everyone have a part in the unwrapping. So the Unitarian Universalism I love does seek to serve the world. We are a justice-loving group of people. And we want to help everyone have a part in the unwrapping because the world is so beautiful. and it is also broken. I love your mission statement, to inspire joy and justice in an imperfect world. Author E.B. White described that he arose each morning torn between the desire to improve the world and a desire to enjoy the world. Have you heard that before? And I believe that to serve the world, we must take time to savor, to plant the roses, to tend to our gardens, to enjoy our children and our grandchildren. And the sun rises every morning, and that moon looks so beautiful as it's waxing these nights. So we continue our work for voting rights, for LGBTQ rights, for immigration, climate change, and environment. There are so many things that we need to serve, to try to help. But as we persevere in our justice work, we can't forget to cultivate our own happiness like a beautiful garden, taking time to taste the sweet juice of those luscious pears, or this morning I had a luscious peach, to feel the rhythm of jazz and the rhythmic waves of the sea. Chapter 4, The Art of Happiness. So how does one go about cultivating happiness? In Positive Illusions, Taylor points out that Rodgers and Hammerstein's songs give us some ideas. Whistling a happy tune, thinking about one's favorite things, raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens. Believe it or not, psychologists have actually used similar techniques. Taylor, in her book, explains that psychologists have followed the example of Peter Pan, who taught the Darling children, Wendy, Michael, and John, how to fly. Think happy thoughts. And apparently, there have been some studies by psychologists in which they lead the participants to think happy thoughts, to concentrate on pleasant experiences. And so Dr. Taylor writes, quote, "Before long, people exposed to these techniques, though unable to fly, report that they feel more cheerful, even euphoric." So does this euphoria have a place in our quest to live as committed, engaged, justice-seeking activists? What if it's all endorphins? But you know what? I don't care whether it's endorphins or fairy dust, because it helps me live a bigger, fuller life and get up each morning with a bit of a spring in my step. It feels like holy work. Cultivating my happiness feels like holy work. So I don't know how many of you saw the old movie Hook. We used to watch it with our kids. So Robin Williams played a grown-up Peter Pan who had forgotten who he was. And so the irony is that he had grown up, become a modern pirate, raiding companies in corporate takeovers. And it wasn't easy, but when the Captain Hook abducted Peter's 2 kids, the only ways that Peter could save them was finding his happy thought. So he just racked his corporate takeover mind. And it was difficult, but finally, when Peter remembered the moment that his son Jack was born, that was it. The moment that his son Jack was born was his happy thought. And so that became the wind under his wings, and then he could fly. Or maybe more recently, Harry Potter. How many of you have read Harry Potter and the Prison of Azkaban? So remember when Professor Lupin taught Harry how to conjure a Patronus. So it's a positive force of hope and happiness that acts as a shield to guard against the Dementor. So these lessons of Hook and of Harry remind me of my wizard father, using his magic to transform Fresno into paradise. So I want to end with one final story, which is that in the days when I was teaching law students to pass the bar exam, how many of you know, either have taken the bar or know people who have? You know, it's stressful. And California especially has a pretty low pass rate sometimes. So, I mean, it's hard under any circumstances, but for people who have emotional baggage, it is really rough. So one summer, I was working in a small tutorial group with a woman named Kim, who had failed the bar already 5 times. And the very first time that she took it, 2 weeks before the exam, her husband was killed in an auto accident. So talk about emotional baggage. But after our first class, she drove home and she said, I was just overcome with this feeling that this time is going to be it. So I worked really closely with her. I got to know her really well. And one of the things that she told me about is that she had a theme song. Remember, like Ally McBeal, she had a theme song that she would use to keep her spirits stoked. And her theme song was Rocky. So when she would get discouraged, she would put on Rocky. She told me that the day that she walked into the convention center to take the exam, Rocky was playing in her mind. And then I don't know if you know that the July bar exam results don't come out until Thanksgiving. So at around Thanksgiving, my phone rings. I pick it up, I say, hello? Da-dun, dun, da-dun, dum. And I knew it was Kim. I said, congratulations, I am so happy for you. So that Rocky helped her keep persevering and lifted her spirits. So I say to you, whether it is Rocky or Rachmaninoff, or whether it is the French Riviera or Fresno, you know, dare to fall in love with a place or with a person. There's that song by, who is it? I Have Been a Fool for Lesser Things, Billy Joel. That's one of my mantras. I have been a fool for lesser things than jumping off the cliff with a faith jump to become a UU minister when I was 50, things like that. So dare to seize your happiness like it is holy work. And so I say to you, may it be so.